This is a RCA 63E 78 RPM record player from 1948. Very Art Deco or industrial modern, whatever you want to call it, and very simple to operate. Pull this over, arm pops up, and it takes a little bit for the tubes to warm up. It's got a 3-tube amplifier. Then to stop it, you just lift it up, push it down, it stops. This video is going to offer some tips on how to restore one of these record players so that you can have a really nice, almost new looking machine. And the first thing that you're going to want to get, and this is tip number 1, is the service literature for this machine. This is a Sam's PhotoFact, and it has the schematic and all the components you need to rebuild the amplifier, which is chassis RS 127. But what you really want to try to do is get a copy of the service manual published by RCA Victor, because it has all kinds of steps to remove all the components from the inside, removing the motor, removing the switch dent, all of that stuff. So this is the best one to get, and I think I downloaded this one from radiomuseum.org, and you can go on there, and I think there's a limit to what you can download each day, but this is the literature that you want to get if you can get a hold of it. Our next tip, number 2, has to do with getting the amplifier out of this cabinet. And I'm going to assume that if you've got one of these and you're watching this video and you're planning to restore this, you already know quite a few things. So I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about things that you probably already know. These tips are just to save you from maybe making a couple of mistakes, or where to find some hard to replace parts that you may not be aware of. So obviously the first thing you have to do is pull this bottom off, and these are little, I forget what you call them, but you just pull them out with a pair of pliers that come straight out, and you can get the bottom off. Alright, I've pulled 3 of these. I'll pull this last one here. I just gripped them with, actually these are wire cutters, and then the bottom comes right off. And alright, I've removed the back, and what we want to be able to do is take this amplifier out so that we can replace the capacitors and any out of tolerance resistors. So to do that, there's a connector right here that you want to unplug. That brings power to the motor, so you unplug that, and then there are several sets of wires in here, and you can actually remove everything except the tone arm wire without cutting anything. I went ahead and cut the tone arm wire, and I would suggest that you do the same, because I'm going to recommend that you replace the tone arm wire anyway with a smaller gauge wire. And then you can just solder it back together and with some heat shrink tubing. I cut these because I didn't read the instructions like I should have, and what I later found out is that you don't have to cut the wires going either to the power switch down here or to the volume control. And all you have to do is remove, there are two screws, you probably can't see them very well, but there are two screws there, 1/4-inch nut driver, we'll take them out, and that frees up the power switch that's activated by the tone arm. And then to get the volume control assembly out, move the tone arm here and reach in there and pull the knob off. Sometimes it may be hard to get off, and if you have to use some pliers to do that, you want to tape up the jaws very carefully so you don't mar the finish on the volume control knob. And then what you have to do, there's a little cardboard box kind of built around this assembly, and you open the top of it, and you can see where I've taped it back shut, but open the top, and then you'll see two Phillips head screws that secure the volume control assembly to the cabinet. Just take a long screwdriver, back out those two Phillips head screws, and you can withdraw the volume control assembly. And then there are three screws holding in the chassis, two at the bottom, one at the top. I believe they are either 1/4-inch drive or Phillips head, not sure, I've forgotten now. I think they're Phillips head. And once you remove those, then the amplifier comes out, and with it will come the switch and the volume control assembly. The speaker is mounted to the chassis. You don't have to disconnect anything there. And once you get it out, then you can replace the electrolytic capacitors. There are two, and a few paper caps, and I found quite a few out of tolerance resistors that I also replaced. After you finish restoring your amplifier, the next thing you're going to want to do is to replace the original cartridge in the tone arm. It will be dead, and there's no replacement available for it. So you'll have to go with a modern cartridge, and this is a Pfanstiehl 151-3. And at the end of the video, I'll tell you where you can get one. And there will also be some photographs following this with better detail. But you're going to have to take this tone arm off to work on it. And there's a shaft that goes down through here, and there's just a little spring clip on the bottom, and you'll be able to see it when you look inside. Pull that little spring clip, and then you can lift the tone arm off. The tone arm wire will come out with it. And in addition to replacing the cartridge and stylus, I also used a much lighter weight tone arm wire because the original is rather large, and it just adds more weight to the tone arm. And replacing it with a smaller wire will reduce the weight and offset a little bit the fact that the holes don't quite match up on the Pfanstiehl cartridge with the original, so you have to use some washers to secure it, and that adds a little weight, so it's kind of a trade-off. Next, you'll want to service the motor, and to get the motor out, make sure it's unplugged from underneath, and then just take out these two Phillips head screws and you can lift the motor right out. Notice that this has already been serviced, of course. Got a new idler wheel. The original idler wheel was pretty bad shape, just hard as a rock and little cracks in it, so I replaced that. And this is a number 1434 idler wheel, and I'll tell you where you can get that. Also replaced the motor grommets. The originals were hard as a rock, and these replacements are actually for a Zenith record player, but they are almost a perfect replacement for the motor in the RCA 66E. The only difference is that the holes in the center of these grommets where the motor mount screws come through are a 1/4 inch inside diameter. The original motor mounts were 3/16 of an inch. There are little brass bushings under these washers in the original. In order for me to adapt these new motor mounts, I got some 1/4 inch styrene tubing, cut it to the same size, 3 pieces, as the original brass bushing, then slipped the brass bushing inside the 1/4 inch tubing, and then slipped them over the screws that come through, and then put the nuts on, tighten them down, and the washers, of course. Again, there'll be some photos showing that in better detail. While you have the motor out of the machine, you're also going to want to disassemble the motor, pull the rotor out, clean it, and then oil the bearings at either end of the rotor. And there will be a sequence of photos that cover that as well after this little clip here. And you may hear me occasionally call this a RCA 66E. It's just something wrong with my brain. It's an RCA 63E, so don't get confused if you hear me call it a RCA 66. I don't know why I do that. Finally, we want to talk about the cabinet restoration. I was fortunate that I got a machine that was in pretty good cosmetic condition, but once I got everything removed from the cabinet, the tone arm off, the first thing I did was simply wash it with simple green, warm water. I was very careful not to get any more water than possible on the inside because there's a real nice label in there and you don't want to get that wet, so try to avoid getting any water inside. Also, there's a cardboard piece that mounts on the other side of the speaker opening that the speaker presses up against, and you don't want to get that wet and warped. Once the cabinet was cleaned, then I buffed it with Novus number 2, and then sanded the gold area here. It didn't look like this, obviously. This has been restored. There was a big scratch running across here, and there was a number of stains all over here. I don't know what it was, but it would not come off. And so I used some 1200 and 2000 grit sandpaper and very finely sanded just the gold area here. I didn't even do much sanding there because you got a lot of edges there and you don't really want to damage that. Same thing on the other side. But you can see that I got that scratch sanded out. And then I took this cabinet up to the Napa paint shop, and I had them match the color and make me up a can of spray paint. And then I simply masked everything off. Of course, the tone arm was still off. Masked everything, all the bakelite, and then just sprayed it. Well, let me back up. I put a coat of primer on first, and when that dried, I wet sanded that primer again using 2000 grit sandpaper, and let that dry for a day or so, and then I applied the gold paint. And then after it dried, I gave just the top area just a very, very light sanding with 2000 grit sandpaper. And as you can see, it turned out really, really good. I just put masking tape over this part as well. I didn't try to remove that. That's very thin foil, and if you try to remove that, you'll probably ruin it. So just, you can put a piece of masking tape over, take an X-Acto knife and very carefully trim around it. And then you won't risk damaging it. So that's pretty much the tips that we have for restoring one of these. Again, I'm assuming that you know what you're doing and that you don't need to be told how to replace capacitors and resistors and check tubes and so on. So if you have one of these and you're going to restore it, good luck, and I hope it turns out better than this one.